Shadow of West brings you stories where a single act of kindness can trigger ancient laws that change everything. In the harsh landscape of 1870s Texas, a lone cowboy's compassionate decision to give his only horse to a wounded Comanche girl set in motion an ancient tribal ceremony he never knew existed. When 80 warriors arrived carrying mysterious white feathers, Jake Morrison discovered that some gifts create bonds that transcend culture and can only be honored through trials that test the very soul. Cowboy Jake Morrison stood facing 80 mounted Comanche warriors, each holding a white feather, and all of them waiting for him. When he'd given his horse to the wounded Comanche girl yesterday, he hadn't thought about this outcome. Now he needed to uncover the mysterious meaning of the white feathers, learn ancient laws, and make the hardest decision of his life. Because the ceremony that would begin at sunset would either make him a brother to the warriors or leave him to die in the desert. The memory of yesterday burned clearly in Jake's mind as he studied the motionless warriors positioned along the ridge above his small ranch. He had been riding fence when he heard the desperate cry echoing across the canyon. Following the sound, he discovered her collapsed beside a dried riverbed. A young Comanche woman, barely conscious, blood seeping through a crude bandage wrapped around her thigh. The smart thing would have been to ride away. This was 1876 Texas, where helping a Comanche could mean death for any white man. But something in her dark eyes had stopped him cold. Not pleading exactly, but a kind of fierce dignity that reminded him of his own mother's strength during her final illness. Jake had lifted the woman onto his horse without hesitation. She was too weak to protest, drifting between consciousness and delirium as he walked alongside the animal for hours through the rocky terrain. Her name was Ayanna, she had whispered during a lucid moment, and she spoke enough English to explain that rival warriors had attacked her small hunting party. When they finally reached the boundary of Comanche territory, marked by 3 sacred red stones that every Texan knew to avoid, Jake had helped her down from his horse. Instead of taking the animal back, he had done something that still made no logical sense to him. He had slapped his horse's flank and sent it after her, watching his only valuable possession disappear into Comanche lands. Now, 18 hours later, his legs ached from walking through the night. His water was nearly gone, and 80 Comanche warriors were studying him like a puzzle they needed to solve. The white feathers they carried caught the morning sunlight, but their meaning remained as mysterious as the silence that stretched between the ridge and where Jake stood in his small ranch yard. But before we continue with this incredible story, make sure to subscribe to our channel, because what happens next will absolutely shock you. One of the warriors, a man with gray streaking through his long black hair, raised his hand slightly. The others responded instantly, shifting their horses into a different formation, not threatening, but deliberate, calculated, like pieces moving on a chessboard according to rules Jake had never learned. The lead warrior began to descend the ridge, still carrying his white feather. The others remained perfectly still, but Jake could feel their attention like a physical weight pressing down on him. Every survival instinct screamed at him to run for cover, but where could he go on foot in this vast landscape? As the warrior approached, Jake noticed details that made his blood chill. The man wore a necklace of carved bone, and his chest was decorated with paint designs that clearly marked him as someone of high rank. But his eyes held no anger or bloodlust. Instead, they showed something far more unsettling: expectation, as if Jake was supposed to understand something that remained completely beyond his grasp. The warrior stopped exactly 10 feet away and spoke a single word in Comanche. Then he pointed directly at Jake's chest and repeated it, his voice carrying an odd note of reverence that made absolutely no sense. Jake cleared his throat and tried the universal language of peace, raising both hands slowly. "I don't want any trouble. I helped your woman because she was hurt. That's all I did." The warrior tilted his head slightly, as if Jake had said something interesting, but wrong. He repeated the Comanche word, this time placing his hand over his heart and then gesturing toward the ridge where Ayanna had disappeared yesterday. When Jake still showed no understanding, the warrior did something unexpected. He smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile a man wore when he knew a secret that would change everything. The warrior reached into a leather pouch at his side and pulled out an object that made Jake's stomach drop. It was his horse's bridle, the one he had custom-made with distinctive silver conchos that his grandfather had given him. But the leather was decorated now with small painted symbols that definitely hadn't been there yesterday. The warrior held up the bridle and spoke again, using different Comanche words, but with the same tone of reverence. He pointed at Jake, then at the painted symbols, then back at Jake. The meaning was unmistakable. These symbols represented something about what Jake had done, and that something was significant enough to bring 80 warriors to attention. From the ridge, a new sound drifted down, singing, high voices weaving together in a harmony that raised the hair on Jake's arms. But this wasn't a war song. He had heard Comanche war songs before during raids, and they sounded nothing like this. This melody carried celebration, gratitude, and something else he couldn't identify. Something that sounded almost like mourning. The warrior noticed Jake's confusion and nodded approvingly, as if Jake's ignorance was exactly what he expected. He tucked the bridle back into his pouch and pulled out something else, a second white feather, identical to the ones carried by the other warriors. He offered it to Jake with both hands, speaking softly in Comanche. Jake stared at the feather, knowing that accepting it felt like agreeing to something he didn't understand, but refusing it might be worse. The warrior waited patiently, still holding the feather between them, while the singing from the ridge grew stronger and more complex. Finally, Jake reached out and took the feather. The moment his fingers touched it, the warrior nodded with deep satisfaction and turned to signal the others. Immediately, the entire formation began to move, not toward Jake, but parallel to his position, as if they were preparing to escort him somewhere. But escort him where? And why did accepting a simple feather feel like he had just signed a contract written in a language he couldn't read? The singing continued, and Jake realized with growing unease that the melody was getting closer. More voices were joining in from somewhere behind him. When he turned around, his heart nearly stopped. Emerging from a canyon he hadn't even noticed was a procession of Comanche women and children, led by an elderly man wearing an elaborate feathered headdress. And there, walking beside the elder, but moving slowly due to her injured leg, was Ayanna. She was alive, conscious, and staring directly at Jake with an expression that mixed gratitude with something that looked disturbingly like pity. The elderly man approached Jake with steps that suggested both ceremony and purpose. His weathered face carried the kind of authority that came from decades of making life and death decisions for entire communities. Behind him, the procession maintained their singing, but Jake could see them watching his every movement with intense curiosity. Ayanna limped forward, favoring her injured leg, but moving with determination. When she reached Jake, she spoke to him in careful English, her accent thick, but her words clear. "My grandfather wishes to thank the white man who gave life back to his granddaughter." Jake felt his confusion deepen. "I just helped someone who was hurt. Anyone would have done the same thing." Ayanna translated his words to the elder, who listened intently and then responded in rapid Comanche. His tone suggested he was correcting something important. Ayanna nodded and turned back to Jake, her dark eyes serious. "My grandfather says you speak words that are not true. Most men would not have helped. Most white men would have ridden past, or worse. But you gave away your most valuable possession to save the life of an enemy. This is not what anyone would do. This is the action of someone who follows the old codes." The elder stepped closer, and placed his weathered hand on Jake's shoulder. When he spoke again, his voice carried deep emotion that transcended language barriers. Ayana listened carefully before translating. He says, "You have honored the sacred law of the horse gift. When a warrior gives his war horse to save a life, he binds himself to that life and that life's people. You did not know this law, but ignorance does not change the binding. You are now connected to our tribe in ways that must be honored." Jake's mouth went dry. Connected? How? What does that mean exactly? The singing stopped abruptly, and the sudden silence felt ominous. The elder studied Jake's face for a long moment, then spoke a single word in Comanche. Every warrior on the ridge responded by raising their white feathers high above their heads. The gesture looked like a salute, but Jake sensed there was much more to it than simple respect. Ayana's expression grew troubled as she translated. He says, "The connection requires a choosing. The sacred law demands that the giver of the horse gift must now prove whether his heart truly matches his actions. If yes, he joins the tribe as family. If no..." She paused, glancing nervously at the armed warriors surrounding them. "If no, what?" Jake asked, though he suspected he didn't want to hear the answer. If no, the gift was a lie, and lies about sacred things must be punished. The horse would be returned to you, but your spirit would be considered poisoned. You would be marked as one who steals honor through false generosity. Jake looked around at the 80 warriors, the elder's unwavering gaze, and Ayana's worried face. He was trapped between two choices he didn't fully understand, both of which would change his life forever. The white feather in his hand suddenly felt heavier than his missing horse, and he realized that his simple act of kindness had somehow triggered an ancient ritual that he was completely unprepared for. The elder spoke again, and this time his words carried the weight of finality. Ayana's translation hit Jake like a physical blow. "The choosing ceremony begins at sunset. Until then, you are our guest. After sunset, you will be either our brother or our enemy. There is no third path." The Comanche village was hidden in a natural basin between towering red rock formations, a settlement that seemed to grow from the earth itself. What struck Jake most was the complete absence of hostility, despite his presence as a white man in their most sacred space. Children watched him with open curiosity. Women nodded respectfully as he passed, and men studied him with expressions that suggested they were measuring something he couldn't identify. Ayana walked beside him, her limp more pronounced now, but her determination unwavering. "You are wondering why no one shows fear or anger toward a white man in their sacred place," she observed. Jake nodded. The thought had crossed my mind. I expected something different. Fear and anger are for enemies. You are not yet enemy, and you are not yet family. You are between worlds, which makes you sacred until the choosing ceremony reveals your true nature. They approached a dwelling larger than the others, decorated with symbols that seemed to tell stories Jake couldn't read. The elder waited inside, seated on a woven mat with various objects laid out before him. Jake recognized his horse's bridle among them, but there were other items too. A knife with an ornate handle, a small clay pot filled with what looked like paint, and bundles of sage tied with sinew. The elder gestured for Jake to sit across from him. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of ritual and tradition. Ayana translated carefully, pausing frequently to ensure accuracy. He says the choosing ceremony has 3 parts. First, you must demonstrate that your gift came from genuine caring, not from seeking advantage or glory. Second, you must show that you understand the sacred nature of sacrifice by making one yourself. Third, you must prove that you can put the welfare of the tribe above your own survival. Jake felt cold sweat begin to form despite the warmth of the dwelling. What kind of sacrifice? And how exactly do I prove that last part? The elder seemed to understand English better than he spoke it, because he responded before Ayanna could translate. He picked up the ornate knife and held it so the blade caught the light filtering through the dwelling's entrance. Then he spoke in Comanche, his tone grave and ceremonial. Ayanna's face went pale as she listened. When she translated, her voice was barely above a whisper. The sacrifice is a test of trust. You must allow yourself to be bound and placed in a situation where only the tribe's mercy will save your life. If your original gift was pure, they will save you. If it was false, they will let you die as punishment for dishonoring their sacred laws. Jake stared at the knife, understanding now why the 80 warriors had seemed so calm and expectant. They weren't here to fight him. They were here to judge him, and depending on that judgment, they would either welcome him as family or watch him die for the crime of false generosity. The sun had moved considerably toward the western horizon when Jake found himself seated in the center of a large stone circle. His hands were bound behind his back with rope that felt stronger than leather, and the entire village had gathered around the perimeter. Their faces were illuminated by torches that cast dancing shadows across the assembled crowd. The 80 warriors formed an outer ring, still as sentinels, their white feathers moving gently in the evening breeze. 5 elders sat facing Jake, each wearing elaborate paint designs that marked their status as judges in this ancient proceeding. The questioning began gently. Why had he been in Comanche territory? Jake explained about searching for new grazing land after drought had destroyed his small ranch. Where was his family? Gone, he told them honestly. Parents dead from cholera, no wife or children of his own. Then the questions became more pointed. Had he helped Ayanna because he hoped to gain something from the Comanche people? Jake denied this, explaining that he had expected nothing but trouble from his actions. Did he consider himself a good man who deserved reward for his kindness? This question made Jake pause, because he wasn't sure how to answer honestly. I don't know if I'm good, he finally said. I just know that leaving someone to die when I could help felt wrong. One of the female elders spoke in sharp, challenging tones. Ayanna translated reluctantly. She asks why you did not try to take me to your own people for medical care. Why give me to the Comanche when you could have been seen as a hero among whites for saving me? Jake felt sweat forming despite the cool evening air. The question cut to something he hadn't fully examined in his own mind. Because she belonged with her own people. Taking her away from everything she knew would have been another kind of cruelty. A male elder leaned forward and spoke a single sentence in Comanche. Ayanna's eyes widened as she translated. He says, "You speak of cruelty, but you condemned yourself to walk 20 miles through dangerous country with no horse, no weapons, and little water. Was this kindness to yourself, or was it punishment for some guilt you carry?" The question hit Jake like a physical blow. Images flashed through his mind, his parents' graves that he had abandoned when the ranch failed. All the times he had chosen the safe path instead of the right one. The loneliness that had driven him to this isolated corner of Texas. Maybe both, he whispered, and the honesty of it surprised him. The 5 elders spoke among themselves in voices too low for him to hear. Jake watched their faces, trying to read expressions that revealed nothing. Finally, Ayanna's grandfather stood and addressed the crowd in ceremonial tones that carried across the entire village. When he finished speaking, Ayanna approached Jake with tears in her eyes. "You have passed the first test. The elders believe your heart was true when you helped me." She paused, wiping her face. "But now comes the test of sacrifice, and I must warn you what they are about to ask of you." The elder opened a wooden bow and withdrew 5 arrows, each marked with different colored bands. When he lifted them for the crowd to see, A murmur of anticipation rippled through the gathering. Ayana approached Jake with obvious reluctance. The test of sacrifice requires you to choose which member of our tribe will face danger to prove your worthiness. 5 of our people have volunteered to risk their lives for your ceremony. Jake stared at the arrows, horrified. I'm supposed to choose someone else to risk their life for me? That's not sacrifice. That's cruelty. That is exactly the point, Ayana replied. The test measures whether you will allow others to suffer for your benefit, or whether you will find another way. But there is another choice. You can refuse to select an arrow, and instead offer to face the trial yourself. This would be... She hesitated. This would be unprecedented. Around the circle, Jake could see 5 Comanche volunteers standing ready. A young man barely out of boyhood, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, an older warrior with scars marking his arms, and 2 others whose faces showed the same mixture of courage and fear that Jake felt in his own chest. I won't choose an arrow, Jake said firmly, looking directly at Ayana's grandfather. If someone has to face danger for my acceptance, it will be me. The elder's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes that might have been respect. The crowd murmured in surprise, and the 5 volunteers looked at Jake with expressions ranging from relief to amazement. But it was the reaction of the 80 warriors that surprised him most. As one, they removed the white feathers from their horses' bridles and raised them high above their heads, creating a forest of pale plumes against the darkening sky. Ayana's grandfather rose slowly from his seated position, his weathered face showing deep emotion as he studied Jake's resolute expression. The elder spoke in Comanche, his voice carrying across the silent village with the authority of absolute decision. When he finished, the 80 warriors responded with a sound Jake had never heard before, a low, rhythmic chant that seemed to come from the earth itself. Ayana stepped forward, tears streaming down her face as she translated her grandfather's words. He says, "No man in the history of our people has ever offered to face the trial alone, rather than risk harm to our volunteers. Such willingness to sacrifice proves a heart that is already Comanche, whether the blood runs Comanche or not." The elder continued speaking, and his next words caused visible shock among the assembled crowd. Ayana's voice shook as she translated. He says, "The trials are ended. You have already passed the test of sacrifice by proving you would rather face death than allow others to suffer for your benefit. The horse gift law is satisfied, and you are declared brother to our tribe." Jake felt confusion mixed with relief. "But I haven't actually done anything yet. I just said I would." The elder smiled for the first time since Jake had met him, and when he spoke again, his words carried gentle wisdom. Through Ayana, he explained, "The trials exist to reveal the heart, not to cause death. A man who chooses certain risk over possible harm to others has shown his heart completely. No further proof is needed." What happened next took Jake's breath away. The 80 warriors dismounted in perfect unison and began walking toward the stone circle. As they approached, each one knelt and placed his white feather at Jake's feet, then removed something from his belt or saddle pack. Jake watched in amazement as a pile of offerings grew before him. Beautifully crafted knives, hand-woven blankets, carved jewelry. Finally, one warrior brought forth Jake's own horse, now wearing new Comanche tack decorated with symbols of honor and respect. The lead warrior, the same gray-haired man who had first approached Jake that morning, stepped forward and spoke in careful English. "White brother, we came here expecting to witness judgment. We did not expect to meet a man worthy of the greatest honor our people can bestow." "What honor?" Jake asked, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening. The warrior smiled. "You are invited to carry the protection of 80 families. Each feather represents a warrior's pledge that your safety is as important as the safety of his own children. This has been given to only 2 white men in all our history. Aishiana's grandfather approached Jake and placed both hands on his shoulders. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of sacred ceremony. He says, Ayana translated, "You came to us as a stranger who gave a gift. You leave as a brother who received 80 gifts in return. But more than that, you have shown our people that some white men understand the true meaning of courage and sacrifice." Jake mounted his horse, feeling the weight of 80 white feathers tied to his saddle and the warmth of acceptance he had never expected to find. As he prepared to leave the village, the entire tribe gathered to see him off, their faces showing respect that would have been impossible to imagine just hours before. "Where will you go now, brother?" Ayana asked as she approached his horse one final time. Jake looked toward the horizon where his old life waited, then back at the Comanche village where he had discovered something about himself he never knew existed. "I think I'll head north toward the mountains. I hear there's good grazing land up there, and it seems I have some new neighbors to get to know." The 80 warriors mounted their horses and formed an honor escort as Jake rode out of the village. Their presence around him felt like protection, family, and home all at once. The white feathers on his saddle caught the starlight, marking him forever as a man who had been tested by ancient laws and emerged as something greater than he had ever imagined possible. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. Share this video with someone who believes in the power of kindness and sacrifice, and let us know in the comments which part touched your heart the most. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most unexpected gifts come from the most difficult choices.